I'm so pleased to welcome everyone back to the Symposium on Disability Cultural Centers in Higher Education. We are together again for Lessons on Building, which is going to be a panel about what happens in the stage right after a disability cultural center has been given the green light. We are very lucky to have panelists today who were involved in building up a disability cultural center. In various ways, they've grappled with how to focus their energies in the first stage of a new disability cultural center development. So I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves and share their thoughts and advice, their lessons from building. We're going to go chronologically and start with Diane Wiener, who served as the first director at Syracuse University, DCC. And then we will move to UIC and hopefully UC Berkeley. I think Anne may have got booted from the call, but we're hoping that that will get resolved in the meantime. So Diane, would you like to introduce yourself and share your thoughts?
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here with everyone. I'm going to put a link in the chat that's from the Daily Orange, which is the student newspaper available in digital and print formats at Syracuse University. It's an independent journalism publication. And given the many conversations yesterday that arose in terms of media, I thought this was an especially useful link, but I also, it's meaningful to, what's that, Margaret?
Thank you for noticing that I'm trying to interrupt. I'm not seeing the caption. Oh, okay. So I'm just gonna continue speaking to see if they are catching up. Lovely. Okay, I think they are back. Okay, thank you, Diane. Let's continue.
Thank you so much, Margaret. So I'm going to put this link in the chat and I'll refer to that in a little bit. And for my own accessibility purposes, I'm grateful to have multiple instruments here. So I'm going to be turning my gaze to read from some content that I prepared for my visual acuity. So I thank you for your patience with me as I read my introduction and my self-description. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored and thrilled to be here. Thank you for inviting and including me. Thanks to Margaret, Javin, and everyone involved in making this space possible. I'm Diane Wiener. I use she, her, hers, they, them, theirs, and Diane as my pronouns. I'm a genderqueer, middle-aged, white, Ashkenazi Jewish person. I identify as neuroqueer, as mad, as crip. I'm an individual with salt and pepper buzz cut situation on my head. I'm wearing green framed glasses. I'm also wearing a black t-shirt from Live On. The shirt says Disability Pride on the top and Disability Awareness at the bottom. Disability Pride and the Live in Live On are turquoise. Disability Awareness and the On in Live On are fuchsia. And preceding the On is a purple heartbeat. And I will show that t-shirt to you on the screen for people who are able to access it visually. I'm holding it up over my mouth onto my nose, and now I will take it down. The accessible multi-formatted video and textual disability cultural storytelling initiative Live On, including its heartbeat, endeavor to underscore that disabled lives are lives worth living. And I'm wearing a dragonfly pendant around my neck that belonged to my beloved Aunt Joan, who is my hero still. I'm joining you today in respectful, accountable, and shared stewardship as I live on the unceded lands of the Cayuga and Onondaga nations in Awaga, otherwise known as Owego, New York. I'm seated in front of a maroon wall with brightly colored various kinds and styles of artwork created by local and global artists, including members of my friendship circle and family. And from 2011 to 2018, I served as the founding director of the Syracuse University Disability Cultural Center. And I continue to be the lead editor of Word Gathering, a journal of disability poetry, literature, and the arts housed at Syracuse University. So we were asked to reflect on a number of questions, which I will share in brief. One of the questions we were asked to reflect on is, how did we set to work? Another question we were asked to reflect on was, what were the ways you focused your energies? Also, what issues did you encounter and what advice do you have? And one of the layers of these questions is, okay, the DCC has been given the go-ahead. What does it mean to build it? What does the building of that entail? So I've spent, many, many years thinking about these questions in different ways as they've been posed today and as they've been posed in other ways in the past. And I think my main focus for today is to really think about the interdisciplinary endeavor of trying to build a disability cultural center. I have enormous gratitude and humility for having been given the opportunity to be the first person in the full-time role of being a DCC director as an administrator at a university. And in that role, immediately what I intended to do, and I believe did effectively without hubris, but with humility, was to engage with the primacy of the student's experience. I was immediately out as a disabled person in the role, and I remain so. I wanted the students always to understand that I wasn't, as I joked yesterday, a suit. I wanted very much, of course, not to be disrespectful to people who do wear suits either, but I wanted to make it clear that this was going to hopefully become a space that emerged and processed its way into being because of the legacy of student activist labors in solidarity with faculty, staff, administrators, alumni, and many members of the communities connected to the university and well beyond. So we set to work by brainstorming, responding to recommendations that had already been made several years prior. Liat Ben Moshe, Professor Ben Moshe, who was on a panel that I was on as well yesterday, talked about the role of the Beyond Compliance Coordinating Committee and making activist initiatives be centered for the Syracuse community. The students in that organization, which is one of the oldest disability justice and disability rights and disability cultural student organizations in the world, was founded in 2001, so it's about to celebrate its 21st anniversary. That organization's members really deserve a great deal of credit for their solidarity and work collaboratively to inform decisions that I then tried to bring to fruition. So we set to work by continuing a conversation, by working with an advisory board, by making sure that every conversation about access that happened on campus included disabled students, and that it wasn't only students who had a great deal of experience in talking about disability necessarily, but students with an array of experiences and identities. We very intentionally aim to avoid a hierarchy of disability, although that certainly continues to be a challenge, as I think we all know, so that we had an array of different ways that people experienced disablement, people who were spoonies, people who were identified as quote unquote mad or sick or crip or any of these terms which don't necessarily have quotation marks around them, neurodivergent people, including autistic people, making sure that we had conversations where we were centering the complexities of deaf cultural experience, and of course, that not all deaf folks identify as disabled. For example, excuse me, when the D Center was starting to come to fruition, there were many conversations about why it was going to wind up being called the D Center, as the capital D and D Center at the University of Washington was meant to designate the simultaneous cultural complexities, separations, and overlaps between disability and deafness as cultural experiences broadly. I think another thing that is important to mention in terms of focusing of energies is that I really wanted to make sure that we were engaging with event management in a collaborative way. And very quickly, the students and I got to work on meeting with people in student activities, in student centers and programming services, obviously and importantly with the leaders and the student employees of the cultural centers across campus, the LGBTQ Resource Center, which was then called the LGBT Resource Center, the LGBTQ Resource Center, the Office of Multicultural Affairs, the International Center, the La Casita Cultural Center. And we worked hard to create a multi-layered, complex, and accessible guide for how to plan events, for how to work on teaching accessibly. We also got to work on creating a language guide. And we also got to work on the minutiae of every single layer of how the space needed to be created accessibly. And I don't say minutiae in a negative way. I mean every detail. So it was big picture, I'm putting my hands up in the air with an arc. And it was also minutiae in the sense of the details, all of the details. One of my favorite examples, which I mentioned briefly yesterday, is the legacy of the door in the center as it was unfolding as a story. We joked oftentimes that the door could have its own memoir. The timing of how the door opened, the way that people would access the door. If somebody were to be using different kinds of mobility devices, they would potentially want to pivot into the button to open the door. All these layers of discussion were all made possible because of conversations with the students, with our allies and accomplices. I want to be mindful of time. So I think once you have the go-ahead, identifying who are the allies and accomplices, identifying the people who might not have buy-in, but might be on the proverbial fence, and thinking about people who really, in fact, may have nothing to do with disability culture, disability justice, what some people would still call disability rights. I'm much more committed to disability justice because of intersectionality, of course. And even if people don't necessarily have buy-in or connection or familiarity, there were people we worked with across campus and beyond campus and all over the spaces in the unceded land, sometimes called the United States, and globally, as well as local participants and activists who were committed to trying to make this come true. And sometimes the people who some folks found weren't necessarily the most familiar to them in terms of disability justice work were the most interested in getting involved. And so collaboration, I think, and networking and solidarity building and mutual aid and kinship and CRIP networking and care work, as it's called oftentimes now, I think all of that is part of the way forward. I can give more specific examples, but I want to pause in the interest of time and in sharing the floor, as the idiom is sometimes used. And thank you for the opportunity to comment and share. Again, in the chat, I put a link to the Daily Orange, and that is the student newspaper, and that is a tag for ways that the student journalists in conflicted and compassionate and complex and nuanced ways thought through disability culture and the Disability Cultural Center at SU. It's not an exhaustive set of articles, but a good sampling. Thanks so much.
Hi, this is Carrie Sandahl. I think that it's my turn to go. Let's see. So visual description of myself. I'm a middle-class, middle-aged white woman with dark blonde hair, wearing a blue blouse and glasses against a blurred background. And what you can't see in the image is that I'm a person of short stature and I use crutches and a wheelchair to get around. And my pronouns are she, her. So thanks, Diane, for laying out the questions that were our prompts for today. So I won't have to go over those, but I'm going to include them in my talk today. First, I want to say what my role was in the development of the DCC here at the University of Illinois at Chicago. So I think my biggest roles were being chair of the Mission and Visioning Committee, being the co-chair of the search committee for the DCC's director. And then now I am an ongoing DCC mentor, informal advisor, collaborator, and one of its biggest cheerleaders. So I want to talk more about my role at UIC because it informs my participation in the DCC. So at UIC, I'm a professor in disability studies in the Department of Disability and Human Development. And I'm the founder of the program on disability art, culture, and humanities. I was the director of Bodies of Work, which is a Chicagoland network of disability art and culture. And now I'm the co-director. I'm also an artist. And I most recently collaborated on the documentary Code of the Freaks, which explores the representation of disability in mainstream film. And I hope you take a look at it for your classes in the fall. Side note. I'm also a scholar of disability and performance as it relates to the formation of disability identity and culture. Also, my personal experience strongly informs my my role and why I'm so invested in the success of the DCC. I'm just going to, inspired by Sandy Yee yesterday, I'm going to just give you some touch points of my personal background that will help contextualize my passion for this center for you. So I grew up in the 1970s and 80s in a small town called Hood River, Oregon, where I was, I had a wonderful childhood, but I was isolated from other disabled people in this tiny rural town. So I took on the role of the inspirational overcomer, which, served me in some ways, but also has been something that I'm constantly battling against. But that's how I thought about my disability at that time. And then I was an undergraduate in the late 1980s at the University of Puget Sound, which is a tiny liberal arts college. And there I was also isolated as a disabled person. And I was really hungry for connection. And on campus, I only knew of 2 other disabled people, at least, who could be identified visually. There was a woman who used a wheelchair, a little person, and me. So we were very visible on campus as being the 3. And also, I tried to begin research on women with disabilities while I was an undergrad in terms of culture and society and primarily the arts, since I was a theater major. But there really wasn't much out there, but my interest was very strong. Then I was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the early 1990s. And there is where I found community of disabled people. And it just really changed my life forever. I went there to study feminist theater, and I was wanting to pursue my interest in disability and representation. And I began to do some research again, but disability studies in the humanities and and the arts just were not developed yet. So there was very, very little on work that could inform what I was interested in. So it was kind of became clear to me that if we wanted this work to happen, we needed to do it ourselves. So I began to make my own work about disability and femininity as a performance artist, a dramaturg, and director. But most important to my development as a scholar, artist, activist, and human being was when I entered my graduate program with the McBurney Disability Resource Center, which is now just called the McBurney Center. That just was overwhelmingly positive situation for me. It was there that I met disabled peers, activists, and scholars. I met national scholars because, like I said, there's very few people who have disabilities who were in theater studies. So the staff there connected me personally, like, oh, I know a guy, Paul Longmore, or, I know a woman in disability in theater, that's Victoria Lewis. So they connected me, they introduced me. I mean, email wasn't even that much of a thing then. So I got on the phone and I'd be like, hi, my name is Carrie. I want to know you. But it was great to have those connections formed. And I worked as an access provider. I developed a disability and film series. I did trainings for teaching assistants on disability. I developed materials. And then I wrote my master's and doctoral dissertations informed by disability studies. And then as a faculty member, formerly at Florida State University and here at UIC, my relationship to disability rights organizations, cultural organizations, arts organizations, they've been a primary means of support, community engagement, and sense of belonging for me. So when I was reflecting on this, it just strongly came to my thoughts that disability resource centers, disability cultural centers, and disability cultural organizations are integral to who I am, not only as a scholar, artist, activist, but as a human being. So given my full immersion in wanting this program to succeed, I got involved in setting up the UIC's DCC. As has been discussed by a number of colleagues out there at different universities, that our university had a long history of disability activism, arts, and culture, also in Chicagoland, that created the conditions in which we were working. There was the student activism that instigated the center's development, as discussed yesterday in the afternoon histories panel. And then we had the legacy of the Disability Resource Center, which under the leadership of Roxana Stoop, always included cultural programming. She was and is a very strong advocate and contributor to disability art and culture. So it wasn't like we were starting from scratch. We had all this good work. And then our Disability Resource Center and Disability Cultural Center were split, and the DCC was moved to the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So where I came in was when the center was formed, I was brought into conversation with our Vice Chancellor, Amalia Paleras, who spoke yesterday. And I actually spent quite a bit of time with her in her office, just explaining what disability culture was, sharing ideas, sharing readings. Also, I brought my confidence and I guess whatever power you can have as a tenured professor to kind of insist that disability culture is a thing and that it was important. So then I was made chair of the Mission and Visioning Committee, and we had a process involving students, faculty, and staff to create the mission, vision, and values. And then I became co-chair of the search committee for the center's director. And then when we started up, I worked with interim directors and then with the director who began in the fall of 2019. And then I currently stay very closely involved in collaborating in programming, being available for troubleshooting, etc. So the ways that I focused my energies in that whole process were, I think, two key ways. The first one was getting buy-in, which I've heard people bringing up, by discussing disability and culture with various communities. I had a lot of one-on-one conversations with administrators, faculty, staff, students. I advised on the selection of committee members. Although my advice wasn't always taken, I developed short reading lists for people, kind of bite-sized versions of disability culture. And then Roxana came up with the idea of having an opening event. This is my second focus of energy. When the center was launched, and it was, I developed a lecture on disability, art, and culture, and that was primarily geared toward administrators at UIC. Students were there, staff was there, it was very well attended. But I gave a history of disability culture. I talked about deaf culture, disability justice. I wove disability poetry in, and then every time I kind of got to one of the definitions I was giving, we included an art break, which were live performances by disabled dancers, musicians, theater artists, whose work I felt reflected the definitions that I was going over. So I want to go now to the lessons learned. And I'm going to share these with you first, and then I'm going to talk about some questions that were raised for us that might be helpful for you. The first is to involve those who paved the way for your center at every stage. Students, faculty, staff, community members, disability culture makers, and creatives. It's really important that the center reflect all these constituencies. Include committee members in whatever committees come up to create these spaces from various campus and communities and constituencies. And the reason why we had a co-chair for the search committee was because being faculty in disability studies, being head of a disability culture, primarily arts program, there was concern that that would kind of skew the kind of leader we were looking for, that it would become like a disability arts center, which would have been fine with me. But really that wasn't what a disability cultural center was about. So we had a co-chair who was amazing, who was well regarded and respected by people across campus, so that I had to have a checks and balances. And as far as I know, he was not identifying as a disabled person, but I could be wrong. Again, use whatever authority you have to center the voices of those with disability experience, especially the students. So in a lot of the committee meetings, we had people on the committees who were new to disability culture, and people who had positions of power. And a lot of times the student voices would start to get lost, or there was power dynamics in the group. And so I was continually coming up with process documents about that we could agree on, that the disabled students' voices would be centered. I would have follow-up and meetings behind the scenes to get people to value what the students had to say and to make sure the conversation wasn't taken away from them. The other point is to be prepared for the emotional labor involved, especially if you, like me, are steeped in the disability movement in terms of your personal and professional identities, and if you've had long involvement, because it can be very frustrating to keep your cool when you have newer people who become, who have a vote in anything but don't have the experience. It can be very frustrating. So, my role and life as an activist kind of clash sometimes with my faculty role. So that was a lot of emotional labor for me of wanting to act like an activist, but needing to be, an administrator and a person who brought people together. So not everyone will understand the choices that are being made. So when I heard the student panel yesterday, I was reminded so much of, there were things that I just, due to privacy laws or, things that were happening in administration and budgets and policies, that we were not able to enact exactly what the students had advocated for. And you can't always tell them why. And that can also be very difficult. And just to give you an example of one of my meltdowns was informing this next lesson, which there were a number of people on our committees who would say things like, this isn't a disability center, this is a center for everyone. Like we should involve non-disabled people as much as disabled people. And knowing how central those, the DCC could be to the development of our students' sense of self and belonging and place in the world, I had a meltdown and I said, well, this isn't called the Center for Everyone. This is called the Disability Cultural Center. So that meltdown, I had to recover from that because I lost it in one meeting. So be prepared for your own potential meltdown. The other couple things is that the process took most of my time for 2 years. So I had to get my chair on board with the fact that I would be doing this work. And I have tenure, and so I could use my time a little bit more flexibly, but if you are not, be very protective of your time because you can get completely sucked in and then you won't be able to do what you want to do or need to do for, as a student or faculty or staff. So you got to really work that out because it's very time consuming. I even worked over the summer on this when I wasn't on contract. That's not something I would recommend, but I did it just because my love was there. Diane brought up a few things that I was going to end with, so I'm going to just briefly touch on them, is to, at the very beginning, be really explore what you guys mean by disability identity and culture, how to include people who don't identify with disability, as Diane talked about earlier. How do you include non-disabled people, allies, and departments on campus? How do you protect disability spaces for disabled people and those who are exploring while also including everyone? Advocate, how do you advocate for a balance of art, culture building, support, disability studies, and activism in programming in the center structure, but also in the programs? How to include disability movement and disabled people's ideas without appropriating them. This especially came up around disability justice for us, because even by being in an academic setting, we couldn't enact all the elements of disability justice. So we ended up in our mission statement saying that we promoted disability justice. So we do everything we can to align with disability justice, but we're not saying we are disability justice because we literally can't always be because of policy and limitations of our environment. We asked ourselves, what is our connection to the community? And that includes national and international disability culture folks, and how we wanted to bring people to our students as well as bringing our students to the community. And then, there's something that we didn't talk about, but I wish we would have. Will you be able to get a sense of what your budget is going to be for the center in terms of staff, access, accommodations, because there's not always funding for disabled staff members who need accommodations, but there is for programming. So other centers or campus entities might not have so much coming out of their budgets for access and accommodations for staff. And so this became something that needed to be negotiated. And I wish I had known that before we ran into it as an issue. So that's the time that I have, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carrie. This is Margaret, and thank you, Diane. Thank you, both of you, for offering your thoughts. I'm popping in because I'm so delighted that Wai-Yee Kwong has been able to join the call after having some technical difficulties. So Anne, if you want to turn on your camera, we can spotlight you.
This is Anne speaking. Thank you so much for everyone's extension of grace and flexibility as I re-logged in on my computer. Margaret, if you could please pull up the introduction slide so I can, in the meantime, provide my image description and land acknowledgement to start us off. That'd be fantastic. Thank you. Thank you.
It's up, and this is Margaret speaking.
Thank you so much. So starting with my introduction, and first of all, thank you so much to my co-panelists. I learned so much from what y'all have shared and your wisdom, and I'm constantly just so grateful for the opportunity at this symposium to be able to learn from and share knowledge with everyone. My name is Wai-Yee Kwong, she, her pronouns. My title is the coordinator of the Disability Cultural Community Center at UC Berkeley. I am currently wearing a off-white sweater on top of an orange dress, wearing a jade necklace, and sporting a black and white hair ribbon in my hair, with various images of abstract sunset art and a cherry blossom mountainous landscape behind me. I identify as blind and is presenting as an Asian American woman in my early 30s. Before we continue, I wanted to provide and offer a land acknowledgement to recognize that UC Berkeley, in addition to the Disability Cultural Community Center, sits on the territory of the Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land where we work, learn, and live. Thank you so much, Margaret, for sharing the slide. I'll provide an image description of what's displayed on the slide and then commence with my sharing of the knowledge. So on the slide, I have some of my basic contact information as well as the link to the UC Berkeley Disability Cultural Community Center webpage. There's a decorative image of the page as you land on the welcome page. In addition, there's also a screen capture of a portion of the petition letter our student and community activists drafted as part of their proposal to create the cultural center space, as well as a text of the land acknowledgement that I just shared with everyone. And thank you so much, Margaret. You could unshare screen.
This is Margaret. It is done sharing now.
Thank you. This is Anne speaking again. So I wanted to provide a from the first year experiences of learning how the center, how to create the mission, vision, core values, and how to really, and what it means to start building the center in community with everyone from my own perspectives. As I shared throughout our symposium, the Berkeley Disability Cultural Center is relatively new. It has been in operation since a year ago, and I was hired in April of 2021 in my current role. After much of the activism, labor has already been put in by all of the student and staff activists to create and advocate for the allocation of the space. So one of the first things that I really wanted to do was convene an advisory body so that I can gather all of the institutional wisdom that folks had before they transitioned away from our campus. As many of us who work in higher education know, students in particular are with us for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, basically a finite amount of time before they transition off campus. So I really wanted to take the opportunity to capture the really the reason and the energy and get down to what it means to the students to have this disability cultural space. I wanted to give a mention to a podcast Alice Wong did with one of our student activists, Elena. And in that podcast, Elena shared from her perspective what it meant to really get into the work of advocating for the space and working with all of the campus stakeholders to finalize the details. So now that I've been hired and this committee is being formed, what next? We met every other week to really dig deep into setting the mission and core values of the center. In this committee, I really tried to incorporate all of the folks who were present, including staff, faculty, and students, as well as the leadership of our executive director of the center, Karen Nielsen, to ensure that as much of their perspectives and the intent of the wants and needs of the center was captured when drafting our mission statement. The mission statement of our center, I wanted to share for context, as well as our 3 core values, were derived from all of those conversations. Our mission currently is the UC Berkeley Disability Cultural Community Center seeks to create and provide a safe and social space for the disability community to build authentic connections and support one another. The space is designed by, for, and with disabled people and will serve as a platform to advocate, educate, and collaborate among students, faculty, and staff to advance and empower both the community on campus and beyond, so persons with disabilities can fully learn, work, and live with dignity. Our core values that were derived, and I'm going to read the 3 of them and then go into a little bit of detail as to what activities we started to really make each of these values come to fruition. The first is community, not compliance. Advocate for the disability community to be represented and included on campus, as well as provide a safe and social space for cultural activities. The idea of the Disability Cultural and Community Center being a space where folks feel, quote, at home, quote, really resonated with me. This was brought up in multiple conversations in our committee by students, faculty, and staff. Folks really also wanted the space to feel comfortable, had different features and amenities to accommodate for sensory as well as physical access needs. And so we were very fortunate to have the support from the division, to have the budget to renovate the space and really build out our dream. So this was something that was really thanks to the work of our executive director in making that budgetary request happen. The second core value is education through empowerment. This includes building an archive of resources and a living disability historical library to foster disability identity and share in innovations. I myself identify as blind and a person with a disability. And being disabled, I wanted to ensure, because throughout my own journey, college was where I learned about my own disability identity. It was where I met other disabled family members, siblings, and really commiserated and congratulated each other on our wins as well as challenges. And so we wanted the space, as well as the committee members shared, they wanted the space to allow for that self-exploration journey for folks. As part of this, we worked very closely with our disability studies department to curate and provide a space to host the disability studies library at the center. And that's really exciting work that we're really happy to engage in. And our third core value is to collaborate and co-create. Collaborating with various campus partners and departments to infuse and situate disability as a greater part of the social fabric of diversity on the campus. And to seamlessly integrate access into physical, curricular, social, and digital environments. One of the things that I personally am really thrilled that is part of my role is to build partnerships and relationships. One thing I quickly learned is that the Berkeley campus is quite large. There are lots of bureaucratic red tapes, and depending on who I met up with, there are different people, different units, different folks I needed to engage to get something to happen on the campus. And as many of our activists and presenters have shared, it also takes a lot of time and energy for something to happen on campus. So as part of this core value, it was very important for me to connect with off-campus partners, local disability organizations like Center for Independent Living, like our local vocational rehabilitation agency that some of our students are registered with, to offer their information to our students. In addition, collaborating with other cultural centers like Carrie and Diane have shared to have folks who are maybe not currently identifying as disabled, but share or are exploring that intersectional identity feel welcome and safe to explore. In addition, also co-create programming with other campus units. One thing we've been actively doing is to work with our new student services unit so that as soon as disabled students are coming into the campus as transfer or first year students, they're able to learn not only about the accommodations and compliance piece, which is also very important for their academic success, but also learn of a cultural group space and community that they can be part of. So we held events like affinity spaces where students can meet with others and talk about their identity. In addition, one thing that we've been really working on is to collaborate with other cultural centers. For Disability Awareness Month, we held a Women and Their Contributions to the Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math Landscape, where disabled activists and employees who identify as women were able to share how it is like for them to work in a space that is traditionally and historically marginalizes women and disabled folks. So I was very happy to see all of these events come into fruition. we're constantly, or at least I'm constantly learning and growing into my role myself, and also connecting with folks in the disability cultural space. So it's been fantastic to have the opportunity to not only participate in this symposium, thank you, Javan and Margaret, but also meet with other folks who have been in the disability cultural space long before me. Lastly, I wanted to share that I had the opportunity to really work closely with folks to start up the beginnings of a Disability Cultural Center Professionals Network, an informal space where staff from different cultural centers can meet monthly to celebrate successes, figure out what are some challenges, and also co and peer mentor one another. So really thank you for staff from DCCs, including the UIC, Longmore, and the University of Arizona for providing a lot of that wisdom for me as I personally continue to grow in this space. And with that, I happily conclude and transition back to Margaret.
Thank you, Anne. This is Margaret speaking. I'm so glad you brought up the network meetings that you've been coordinating. I'm so grateful for those spaces. And I'm glad that it's coming up in this context so that anyone who is working at a center or a nascent center knows about it and can reach out and get connected. Okay, so we have a good half an hour for Q&A. So that's really exciting. I'm gonna ask Javan, the access tech person for this session, to open the chat. And I will just thank our panelists again. I think you all got into a really nice balance of the extremely practical and the more like guiding principles for the work of building. So I am giving people some time to gather their thoughts, but you're welcome, everyone in the audience, you are welcome to put something in the chat. Javan will read that out loud. Or if you'd like to use the raise hand function, I can call on you and we'll be alternating. So,
Margaret, this is Diane. May I quickly interject something that might be useful? Is that okay, briefly? So is that a yes? I think you said yes, just making sure. So I put in the chat the Syracuse University Disability Cultural Center's YouTube channel, which includes a lot of historical content, including event recordings over the years. I also put the resources section of the Cripping the Comic-Con, which we hosted for many years at Syracuse University in affiliation with the Disability Cultural Center and since. And I put some resources and CRIP cultural content from the Office of Interdisciplinary Programs and Outreach at the Burton Blatt Institute, for which I served as a research professor and associate director until a few weeks ago. And so all of that stuff is, food for thought and just intended to be resources to share with everyone here. We have a lot of material, including how to support people in effective inclusivity around image and audio description resources. And there are also just lots of different kinds of events. There are more events that are about to be posted on that website soon. Even though I'm no longer there in that role, we're still putting together some things from a series we just hosted in the recent months. So just for people's interest, and thanks so much.
oh, thank you, Diane. And I see that Carrie has her hand up. Go for it, Carrie.
Thanks. This is Carrie speaking. There was one other point that I wanted to mention that's a really important lesson learned that I skipped over when I was talking. If you're looking to hire a center director, make sure that in your job announcement, your interview questions, your committee discussions, that you talk with HR about what is an admissible job factor because if you have an identity-based center, you know, it can get very confusing about conversations that you're allowed to have about the candidate's identity and whether that can rank as a job factor. So that was very tricky terrain, and I strongly encourage you to talk with HR carefully about how to make sure you're following policy and serving the center at the same time, because you don't want to have the integrity of the search at all ever questioned. So that was one of the roles I had to play as well, is by making sure that the conversation, you know, for any part of a person's identity stayed within the policies of the university. Because like I said, I didn't want there to be any challenge or sense that we were unfair or that we weren't, that our search result would be challenged.
Hi, this is Javin. I have a question that was directly messaged to me that I'll read aloud. If you'd like me to say your name, let me know. Otherwise, I'll just keep you anonymous. A question for Anne specifically. The Cal disabled community seems to be making real progress around the DCC, but oh, well, the name isn't here. But UC Access Now has received a number of reports of Cal being very ableist regarding online access to school/work during this ongoing pandemic and regarding public health measures that keep us safe. How do you feel about this dichotomy at Cal? How can the DCC help push back where policy is concerned?
So this is Anne speaking. Thank you so much, Javin, for articulating that question, and the original poster for asking and phrasing that question. So I think this really speaks to Carrie's point about sometimes, as a person who is disabled myself and a staff member on campus, there are multiple roles, hats, positionalities that I feel like I have to navigate myself in that space. Being a former graduate as well from UC Berkeley, oftentimes I empathize with and sometimes unfortunately recognize that maybe things have not changed since I've attended the university. In addition, I think that because of the pandemic, there has been a lot of movement and changes around in general, what it means to be accessible. How is learning conceptualized? So I think because of all of those factors, sometimes it is tricky, especially from a disability culture standpoint, where the space is supposed to be and meant to be safe for folks to come in, organize, and be political. One thing I have found to be helpful or strategy is to really start building relationships with students and to support some of their advocacy work from my current role. So for instance, from what you've shared, there have been some practices at Berkeley that students may not always agree with, and that they feel are student activists that some of the campus practices are ableist. And so right now they are working on a project that is to develop an anti-ableism curriculum for other cultural centers, for graduate student assistants to be able to take this curriculum or bring their projects to this space so they can learn how to improve accessibility and disability awareness in their content. And so in that, our center is working with folks to help them mitigate some of the administrative labor of hiring student workers to be able to facilitate and develop this training, as well as help them build some of those bridges with the other cultural centers to offer that training. So those are some ways in which kind of behind the scenes, so to speak, I myself have personally found to be ways to support students. Hopefully that answers your question.
Hi, this is Javin. I'll be reading another question from the chat. This is from Dr. Liz Thompson. Budgets have been mentioned. How can students do research, RE, DCC budgets, when some are at private institutions? Or they don't know how to access public institutions' budgets? And I think this question is for everyone.
This is Carrie speaking. I wish I knew the answer to this question. So that's why I'm not saying more. I don't know if the other panelists or maybe anyone else who's here has answered this question, because I'd really like to know the answer to this one as well.
Yes, this is Diane speaking. I'm nodding here, very avidly nodding. And I know this is being recorded for, legacy and archival purposes. So I'll just say that with care and also transparency, since that's how I intend to roll. When I was director, it was at a private university that's also a nonprofit context. It was complicated when people asked me this question, frequently asked me this question, and I was given the message in a caring but also assertive way that it was not necessarily appropriate for me to share the contents of the budget with others, including with students who might be wanting to set up DCCs or actively engage. I think that I see that it says in the chat that UIC, Dr. Thompson, Liz added, UIC has a public grade book for salaries, but unsure about office budgets. I think most of that content is not public, even at public universities. So I think the way to handle it in part is to have informal anecdotal conversations with people. And that's my answer. And I have now said that on record.
This is Margaret. I do also want to acknowledge that we are recording this session, but I do have a lot of curiosity around this question because I've also been asked this question in the context of other centers who are setting things up. And I also want to share that I come from a student organization background. Like, that's my background. I was a graduate student organizing other students at the University of Chicago. I was a teacher, I was doing my PhD in an English department. So I am, like Anne mentioned, learning about administration and how that goes. So I don't know if anyone in the room knows why the privacy needs to happen and feel comfortable saying it in this space.
This is Javin again. This isn't a question, but I want to read Amelia Marie's point, which I think Diane promoted as well. Amelia Marie writes, I would recommend going to the person in the higher ed department who teaches finance related to the finance related class and ask how to access public budgets available at their own institution. Specific budgets won't be available for the most part, but this can be a starting point.
This is Diane again. I'll just briefly add that when Lydia Brown from Georgetown at the time and Ann Lutzow, one of the founders of the D Center at the University of Washington, UW, and at the time, Linda Wolford, I hope I'm pronouncing their name correctly, from Minnesota at the time, and Wendy Harbour and I worked together to put together a kind of a booklet online. And then this is something that Dr. Liz Thompson and I talked about shortly before they became Dr. Liz Thompson, but now they are Dr. Liz Thompson. So the gathering materials and trying not to reinvent the proverbial wheel of shared resources that could be housed somewhere for people who want to create DCCs. And even though each space, of course, has its own unique, specific needs and orientations and requirements, et cetera, that there are certain things that are consistent. And I think that some of the research that folks have done, Dr. Sala and Dr. Thompson and others, helps gather some of that up. And one of the questions that's consistent is the budgetary question. So I actually have this folder digitally available, which has, the original job descriptions and all these kinds of things. And there are layers of budget implied in some of that content. And so I think another way to think about it is to think about what the budgets are for certain types of things, even if the specific budget can't always be publicly shared. That's another way to think about it. I hope that made sense in terms of my phrasing.
Hi, this is Javin. UC Access Now in the chat has written a question. For public universities, couldn't the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA is the acronym, otherwise pronounced as FOIA, be used to find out budgets? If there's no answer, we can also just circle back to it. So it's also kind of like a legal question that some of us may have never encountered. But that's a really good question, though, using the Freedom of Information Act. Let's see. Amelia Marie writes a comment. Also, I've found through personal experience at private institutions, if you actually call up their HR, they will tell you what salary bands of published positions mean, even though it won't be published anywhere public on their institutional website. And I do have some anonymous questions that I can ask. So the anonymous person writes, how much activist roles that DCC can get involved when facing ableist campus infrastructures, campus environment / space arrangements? Have you seen any campus disability, or would you prefer me to do one question? This is to Margaret. Do you think I should read all? There's like 3 or 4 questions. Should I read one or all of them at once? It's direct message to me.
I think let's talk about the question you just read. Is that what the question was, Javin?
Yeah, so I'll just repeat it. First question. So how much activist roles that DCCs can get involved when facing ableist campus infrastructures, campus environment, or space arrangements? So how much of an activist role can you have as a DCC, I guess is the question, when it comes to encountering those things?
This is Carrie. I think that's a really complicated question and would probably depend somewhat on the culture of your university and the context. But one thing that I've found in my various roles at the university is there are battles that you can take on in whatever role you're in, and that at some point the ableism can be so overwhelming, you have to, for your own self-care, or just for your time and energy, and ableism is so prevalent. You start to feel when you've had successes that maybe you've chipped away at ableism a little bit, and it can be so discouraging when you run into these roadblocks and excuses and justifications for why things are the way they are, that it can be easy to either spend all your time and emotional energy on it, and needing to know when it's time to tackle something that you can. But I also, it helps me when I run into those situations to keep track of the people who have been allies in change and the people who have created roadblocks, and what forces you can marshal. And sometimes choices are made that affect the architecture or landscape of the university that would be incredibly significant to undo once it's done, right? And so those things I think are the hardest, because you feel like you've been given a seat at the table, but you don't always, you know, what you say doesn't, and all the activism you can muster from all sources sometimes will not be effective. But to remember to always preserve yourself, because you won't be able to do the work if you can't, you know, figure out how to address these roadblocks. But it can be very frustrating, and I think I'll just leave it at that. Yeah, it can be disheartening. I mean, I feel like there has been a lot of progress, but at the end of the day, there are structures that are so much beyond your ability to make a dent. Oh, I remember what I wanted to say is, this is a good role for tenured professors and for full professors. So now I'm full professor, so I feel a little more free to say things, hence what I've already said on this meeting. But you know, I've asked people to use my position, use the shield that I have as a full professor, for me to say some of the things that they don't feel protected in their positions to say. So students, staff, junior faculty, find those people that, you know, can say the hard things, or the things that are going to be unpopular, or the things that people won't like. That can be a strategy.
This is Javin. I just read through the list of questions, and so as a follow-up to the question that I've just asked and Carrie just provided an answer to, it expands to disability resource centers. So the remaining questions of this anonymous person say, have you seen any campus disability resource or learning centers play an activist role in campaigning and fighting back against universities' decisions for ableist practices? I'm thinking about this question because DCC and DRC receive fundings from the university. So I wonder if it would make things more difficult for the DCC or the DRC to speak up.
This is Diane, and if it's all right, I'll try to address this with some reflection. So first of all, I think that there has sometimes been a separation between disability cultural centers and disability resource centers and/or offices of disability resources and services, et cetera, accommodations offices. That has been a separation that was necessary. And in other contexts, I think that it creates an opportunity in that separation to maintain separate roles that are necessary and legally important because of the ADA, which I hope the Supreme Court leaves alone. And I've said that on record too. Because of the ADA in this part of the world, we are allegedly going to continue to have accommodations assured in higher educational contexts. And so there has to be someone in an office like that in a university. It's not an option because of the law. It is not necessarily legally required, of course, to have a disability cultural center. So I think one of the layers here is, how does the student leadership and how do student allies and accomplices and other constituents work in meaningful collaboration between and across these different units if they are both on campus? And it doesn't have to be an adversarial relationship, even though the roles have to be distinct, I think. So at SU, for example, the Disability Services Office, which is now called the Disability Resources Center, has a disability rights or human rights, disability justice is an important centering principle and conceptual framework and activist space. That's part of how that office operates. And so a resource I want to harken back to, which is again historic, but necessarily, and I think meaningful to this day, is 10 tips for students with disabilities by students with disabilities, which was originally published when SU hosted DREAM. And Dream, of course, is now connected to AHEAD, and there is a digital version of this. And it's a way to help students, whether or not they're affiliated with creating a DCC, think about how to work effectively with the Disability Resources Center to advance disability justice work. And so I think that's a very important resource. Another example, I think briefly, is that there are lots and lots of ways that it depends on who's in leadership, of course, right? So someone could have a really difficult, complicated, shitty, I'll say it, shitty history with disability resources and accommodations provisions not being done effectively or adequately or right. But that was because of who was in leadership. And if that changes, there could be a really positive relationship there that unfolds. So that's just, those are just some reflections for what they're worth.
This is Carrie. I'm thinking about the student panel histories yesterday when the UIC students were talking about how they had asked and argued for and labored so hard over keeping the DCC and the DRC together. I think that's a really interesting move on their part because they recognize the connection. I think that our Disability Resource Center had been a place of belonging and gathering and creating those connections. So, you know, in their estimation, they saw that as a productive connection, even to be this in the same entity. So that, and then our current Disability Resource Center director, Sophia Hamilton, she worked in collaboration at every stage of the foundation of the DCC and has been an ongoing collaborator and very positive support. But, you know, they have different legal requirements and things they have to adhere to and limitations that the DCC doesn't have. So you can also find ways, just like I said, use your tenured and full professors to say things. You can also find strategies for what kind of feedback or activism or change or role in any of the situations you may find yourself in, because it may be where one organization is limited, the other one has more freedom and vice versa. So, you know, cultivating that relationship as much as you can, if it's possible not to be adversarial. I want to say Dean Adams, who was an interim director, he played a significant role in developing that relationship between the DRC and the DCC. And I think that helped to lay the groundwork for when Margaret came in. Margaret was able to kind of pick up the baton and continue with it. But as much as possible, I think it doesn't serve people well to have that adversarial relationship. Maybe the student activists, because they can say things I think that wouldn't be prudent or do things that wouldn't be prudent for faculty to do. Again, taking advantage of those different roles, I think, is something strategic you can think about.
All right, thank you for those responses. I will continue to read through the chat. This is Javin speaking. So Owen asked, so this is kind of like 10 minutes ago, but Owen asked, is the digitally available folder Diane mentioned shareable with specific people who are working on similar projects? If it's not able to be shared publicly or the booklet also mentioned, and Diane responded, I am happy to share the folder. Yes, I have shared this folder with dozens of students and others over the years. Folks say they would love access, and Diane responded, anyone who wants access to these now rather old digital folder materials is welcome to email me at wordgathering@syr.edu. And then Brian followed up and said, I will also make myself available for anecdotal conversations about Duke University's DCC and private institution budgets and the work around we've made through their red tape. He posts the email, bhr16@duke.edu. Diane joked, Brian, at SU, we call it orange tape, LOL. I just thought that was funny. Let's see. Emily Smith asked, where can we find the article that was just mentioned, that Diane mentioned? And then Diane posted the link for NCCSD Clearinghouse. It's an archival link. And then Karen Nielsen from the UC Berkeley DCC writes in the chat, at UC Berkeley, the student activists who obtained our DCC also advocated for an ongoing relationship with DSP, which is the Disabled Students Program. I agree that leadership and the needs of a specific campus matter. Also, our budget details are available to anyone who asks. All right, we do have a few more minutes for Q&A if anyone wants to ask a last question. Or Margaret, would you like to close?
Thank you, Javin. This is Margaret speaking. I just want to check in with Anne to see if you have any thoughts that are percolating as we've been having this discussion, or any other things you want to add.
This is Anne speaking, and I think after hearing all of my co-panelists share their thoughts, I think the one word that that really is resonating with me or sums up all of the thoughts is sharing and care, community care, because there's so much injustice I personally feel in different spaces, and with sharing of the resources so that at least I myself don't have to reinvent the wheel, and just the immense community care within the disability family, I'm hopeful that someday there will be broader DCCs and that hopefully we can slowly work away at the ableist culture and infrastructures.
Thank you for that, and that's a lovely closing reflection. Yes, I'm thinking a lot about how some of our conversation is shut down by forces that make us feel like we can't say things openly, and I agree with you that one of our biggest assets is one another and making these connections, having these conversations. So thank you. It's about time. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this session. I want to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and your wisdom and your lessons learned. And also thank you to the access workers. So I just want to give a little, orienting information. We are now going to take a lunch break until 2 p.m. Central, so an hour and a half break. And then we're going to come back, and it will be our first set of breakout sessions. So if you were in the welcome this morning, Javin kind of cued this to all of us, but I want to remind you that we will be having concurrent sessions, so we will not be meeting in this main Zoom room, which has been the location for the symposium so far. Instead, we'll be meeting in 2 separate Zoom rooms that are all linked right under the description on the symposium website schedule. So if you stick to that schedule, you should hopefully find the right Zoom room. And the topics for the first breakout sessions are going to be designing a DCC, some of the nuts and bolts decisions that are made around space, budget, staffing, and then also centering student leadership and engagement. So should be good. Thank you again, everyone, for this wonderful conversation, and take care.